Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Region 8 chapters of HFMA. The title for today's webinar is Bending the Hospital Cost Curve, New Approaches to Managing Your Medical Equipment Expenses. I'd like to welcome two guest presenters for today's webinar. We have Matt Werder, CDO of Hennepin County Medical Center, and Peter Robson, CEO of MEGA Solutions. Matthew Werder brings over 20 years of healthcare experience in his position as Chief Technology Officer at Hennepin County Medical Center, a 477-bed Level 1 trauma center and academic medical center in Minneapolis. In his role, he is responsible for advancing HCMC's technology vision and strategy to enable the organization to achieve its critical priorities. Currently, Matthew is leading the development of an enterprise telemedicine strategy, migration to a new data center, and leading the execution of the organization's technology strategy. I'd also like to welcome Peter Robson of MEGA Solutions. Peter is the founder and CEO of MEGA Solutions, who provides services to hospitals that optimize spend and maximize savings from medical equipment lifecycle costs. So without further delay, I'll hand the call over to our guest presenters. Peter, I think you're up first.
Thanks very much, Nikki, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Really excited to be here. I know Matt and I think that these kind of forums are really great, both to learn from and contribute to, so we're excited to participate. We're also excited that there's lots of you from many different states, not only throughout the Region 8 membership, but even beyond that, friends and colleagues, from both coasts. And I think what's cool about that is that everybody in your roles faces different, unique regional and state-based or geographic challenges, particularly on the financial side of the hospital operations. And so to have all these different perspectives participating is just exciting for us, and hopefully you'll find it beneficial for you. So what we're going to do is just we'll quickly walk through the agenda and what we plan to cover. And our goal is to make this session as useful as possible. If we can give you one thing that you can take away that you find that you can apply to the work that you do back in your respective hospital, that will certainly be a success from our perspective. But we would also encourage you to reach out via the chat function and ask any questions that you have, because this is supposed to be a useful environment to learn from. And if we're not understanding what you want to hear, send it in and we'll make sure we try to cover it. So the plan for today is to cover three primary topics that all relate to how each of you and us working together can bend your hospital's cost curve as it relates specifically to medical equipment. And when we talk about bending the curve, we mean structural cost reduction that permanently adjusts the cost of certain components of hospital operations or care delivery. So the first is why medical equipment? Why is it a topic worthy of the time and attention that all of you have chosen to give to it today, and why is that an opportunity that we think is exciting? And second, what do we mean by new approaches? I mean, there's plenty of reasons in healthcare sometimes to be skeptical about things that are new or innovative, and it's a balancing act, but we hopefully will convey some reasons that we think a new way of looking at some of the same recurring challenges may be helpful, again, as it relates to medical equipment and capital. And then third and finally, and what I'm most excited about, is that Matt is going to walk you through three strategies that really have evolved out of best practices and experiences that we've both had. But most important, Matt will tell you exactly how he and his team at Hennepin County Medical Center have been applying those best practices, putting them into action, and actually driving the needle on some of these kind of cost curve bending initiatives that I can't imagine most of you aren't involved with in some way, shape, or form. So our assumption going into this session finally is that everyone participating is in some way looking for or has a strategy that requires understanding savings opportunities inside your hospital. And so we're going to make that assumption, and that the sort of the how-to is going to focus more on what you can do to actually find and extract more of those savings from medical equipment. So with that, why medical equipment, and why should you focus on what may be, less than 10% of typical hospital cost structure on an annual basis? Well, the first is because it's really, really relevant. Not only is it big, and I'll talk about that with some numbers and data in a second, but it may be less than 10% of your cost, but medical equipment and clinical technology touches 99+% of the patient care that you're delivering. So while you look at it through one financial lens and say it's a smaller portion, it's strategically critical and also pretty substantial as a percent of what the untapped, unrealized savings opportunities may be. If you think about revenue cycle, you guys are already heavily invested in rev cycle savings and in payroll and staffing and labor optimization and supply optimization. This is an area that doesn't yet have that same level of maturity, and again, we see it as an opportunity. We'll share some examples in a minute. Second, it's strategic, right? We talked about the importance that it plays, the percentage of care it delivers, but equipment plays a role in physician retention and recruitment strategies. It plays a role in standardization and interoperability with technologies like EMR and PACS and complex enterprise systems. And then also, and we'll explain this, this is probably jumps out a little bit, it's not a toaster, and I'm going to hit pause, and we're going to let Matt explain what we mean by that in just a minute. And then finally, the significance of medical equipment is not only is it financially substantial, which we'll show you the size in a second, but it also is the last untapped savings frontier that as you look at the advancement of technology and the critical dependency on software and emerging technologies and innovation, structural cost reduction and how you manage the capital resources being invested in medical equipment can create a permanent advantage and a lasting, sustainable differentiation in the cost of delivering care or running your operation. And we believe in the work that I do, and I know Matt and I have talked enough about it and how the hospital is trying to adjust to today's economic reality. Bending that cost curve is not a nice to have, it's a must have. And so the idea that this is an untapped area means it's an opportunity for nearly everyone at some level. So we talked about big. $95 billion annually is the collective U.S. hospital spend on medical equipment and related life cycle costs. So when we talk about the medical equipment life cycle and the $95 billion, it's comprised of purchasing, servicing, maintaining, and keeping current medical technology, and then finally at the end of life, cost related to the removal, replacement, and disposition of medical equipment. So when you add that all up and you look at the savings data that we've seen year over year in the 14 years that we've been doing this, 12 to 16% kind of portfolio savings across the life cycle is the typical opportunity that we see hospitals able to extract, meaning net savings, hard dollars, straight to the bottom line. And this statistic about 75% of the life cycle costs that occur after the purchase, I think particularly in a lot of the work we've done, we know that it's sometimes hard in the financial part of the business that you guys occupy to have sufficient visibility to all of the different costs and contractual commitments that each department or clinical specialty may be managing. And so, but if you just recognize that for every dollar that you may be spending on the procurement of equipment, there's $2 or more being spent each year to support and maintain that fleet. It'll also help you maybe see some of the areas of cost that haven't gotten as much attention, that are part of where these hidden savings lie. And then finally, if you just think about it sort of for what's in it for you, each of your hospitals, sorry about that. The $13,000 estimated annual savings per bed is on a rate basis the run rate that we see as the available opportunity. And the real question is how much of that can you capture through the many different initiatives that I'm sure all of you are part of in some way. So I hope that's helpful. That really is a long version of a short story, which is for a typical 300-bed hospital, it's an annual opportunity of $3.9 million of incremental hard dollar savings that is out there and available. And we're going to talk about how you can go after some of that in just a sec. You have something to? Okay. So I'm going to give this one over to Matt, who's going to explain to you what on earth we mean by a toaster.
Absolutely. So it wasn't that long ago, probably the 1990s or even the 2000s, that clinical equipment was just like a toaster. Meaning you went to the store, you maybe looked at some of the features, what color you wanted, but you took it out of the box, plugged it in, and it worked. And yet today, despite maybe some Bluetooth functionality with toasters, it's really hard to know exactly what the future holds for a technology and clinical equipment requirement standpoint. We try to anticipate and forecast the resources needed, but these requirements of clinical equipment are changing rapidly. Today's equipment includes additional costs beyond just the purchase price. And it includes costs beyond the equipment itself, interfaces, facility costs, other integrations with other technologies. And it really isn't as simple like a toaster it used to be. So I thought maybe at one time, talking to our CFO, to see if maybe we should look into hiring a psychic to forecast and to really look into some of these circumstances. So I'll pass it over to Peter.
Yeah, how'd that work, Matt?
Didn't work out too well.
Not so good. I think and we wanted to have a little fun with this, right? But the point is that even the experts, and I put you all in the category of experts in some fashion of financial responsibility, right? It is really, really hard to predict the future. It is equally hard to create and maintain and adjust accurate forecasts that take into account not only what you know today, the obligations that your hospital may have and the contractual boundaries that you're required to operate within, but then all of the variables you can't see or control. And we get it. I mean, we see it every day. So it's not good news, but I guess the good message is you've got lots of company of folks facing the same challenges. But there are things that you can do about it, and again, we're here to talk about bending the curve, structural cost reduction, and let's not rely on the psychics, let's rely on you guys, and let's tell you how we think we can get some of that done. What we wanted to do is just kind of lay some groundwork in terms of some principles that we believe through the years of working through this stuff in not only Hennepin, but hospitals that we've worked with as well. That there's sort of some macro principles that can help you sort of set the stage. The overall, and you heard me talk earlier about the medical equipment life cycle. Often we see hospitals operate in a very transactional mode, particularly around medical equipment, because of the nature of the product and the procurement process and all of the things that go into selecting an MRI or fleet of infusion pumps or replacement endoscopy equipment. But as you start to think about, we talked about the $1 of procurement cost creating $2 or more in annual service and support cost, moving to a more comprehensive view over the life of that asset in your operation will allow you to have visibility into costs that you may not see as clearly today, but that can easily be managed. So that mindset shift, while it's not easy, it can give you visibility in ways that can be huge. Second, we see this a lot. It's a very complex process, and capital equipment is episodic, meaning I might buy an MRI every 5, 7, or 10 years. So often the current processes for supply chain and procurement that are built around standards and replenishment strategies and efficiency and turns, right? It's generally considered sort of good enough to make it okay to go buy the MRI. But if it's costing you an extra $500,000 or $1 million in one-time non-recurring costs, imagine how many other times it might happen each year with a different product And if you can standardize the way you look at some of that stuff, it can help allow and enable your organization to avoid those pitfalls. And then third, emotional decision-making and the fear of losing out. I'm sure it never happens at your hospital, but imagine for a second a cranky doctor, right, or a department manager who's under the gun to increase throughput, and they simply need to take care of whatever it is so that they can get back in the business that they're so good at, taking care of patients. And this fear of losing out, what we mean by that is that if I don't do it now, I may not get the budget. Or if I don't buy this from the vendor, they've told me they're going to raise the price by 10% next month. And there is a real fear of losing out because the opportunity to get the resources you need at the time that you both need it, and the hospital typically has the ability to fund it, it doesn't always work out that way. So again, we get it, but even in the context of all of that, there's tons and tons that can still be done. And then finally, and Matt's going to, I think, share some really great frontline perspective on this. We see it a lot. Hospitals internally speak many different languages, right? The financial perspective with ROI, right, and accounting standards and key performance metrics that are probably very central to the work many of you do is different than what some of the department and clinical folks may be measured on in terms of outcomes and patient throughput and efficiencies and so forth. And then, if you go to clinical engineering, that's more technical in nature, again, very critical to the medical equipment life cycle. They live in a world of kilowatts and amps and calibrations that, again, are vital in the care and services that you provide and deliver. So all of this really starts with having the right information. The business that we're in is an information business. Matt, as a technology leader and someone who's a deep supply chain sort of expert, has spent a world of time in the data world. The right information is critical to any of the strategies that we're about to share with you. So I'm going to throw out a challenge that I think reflects a way that we look at it with the clients that we work with, but we hear this and learn this from the hospitals that we talk to every day around the country. There is a need for a new approach to dealing with the uncertain future that I think we already suggested the psychics may not be able to help us with enough, right? The accurate forecasts, the knowing what's coming, managing across time, and looking at what's the cost to deliver so that I can bend that curve down. The old way of looking at medical equipment and measuring and benchmarking and validating what you're going to buy, how much you're going to pay, how much you're going to pay to service it across the life, again, traditionally a transactional mindset. I'm going to quickly walk through, and Matt, jump in on any of these because you've done a lot of this. If you look at the activity that's required, so for contracting, right, the initial phase of product purchasing, right, the old paradigm was I'm going to tell the vendor how much I'm going to spend, I'm going to commit to volumes, negotiate a discount, and there'll be penalties if I don't meet my obligations. We don't think that works anymore. It binds hospitals to a plan that needs to be flexible. And as we see and work with many different vendors who do amazing things to be flexible and try to find ways to meet your needs, the new paradigm allows for this idea of how do we work together to anticipate the potential we have and contract for incentives to earn and win more business as a vendor and to save more money as a hospital, but let's align our interest. And it really does work. The value metric, the measure of how we're doing in the procurement phase, right? Net price, what am I paying? Unit cost. But the reality is the total cost of ownership, particularly with clinical assets that may have a greater than 10 years of use in the hospital. I mean, what's the average age of some of your older?
I would say we have, telemetry monitors that are lasting, 15 years. And so, the purchase price back in 2000 is significantly less than what it is today. Yet alone was that device ever intended to speak with an EHR, to speak with other systems that are now new costs that we'll have to figure out new ways of approaching that price.
Completely, and actually you emphasized a really good point, which is this idea of total cost of ownership. Just think about the scenario that Matt explained. Older technology, still satisfying the clinical requirement, but the interoperability or the connectivity to, current state technology, right, doesn't work. So do you need to replace the monitors, or do you go about some kind of a bridge or patch strategy, right? These are really, really hard and complicated decisions. So again, we're not trying to make light of it, but only if you look at, hey, if I upgrade Matt's monitors today, how long will it sustain the clinical use of those systems? And does the total life payback really truly make sense, right? And for each of you, the answer is going to be different. I will spill one punchline is that we do not have a silver bullet or a little magic pill that we can send out after this webinar that makes all of this stuff magically happen. But again, let's keep going, and hopefully we'll give you something close. Coverage, service coverage. We talked about the life of an asset and the need to, especially in today's software-driven environment, right? You're increasingly dependent on supplier-provided coverage in the form of software support agreements and upgrade agreements. And Matt, you know this in a lot of the stuff we've done and that you do in your work. So you're really bound, once you pick a platform, to spend a lot of money upgrading, maintaining it, and keeping it current. But service coverage, the uptime, all the penalties, again, that's the old world. Today it's all about how can I maximize the reliability and the connectivity and the speed of my systems while at the same time encouraging and maximizing utilization. And oh, by the way, making sure that we never fail, because we're a hospital and we cannot have critical infrastructure fail, right? It's a really tough balancing act, but when you look at the reliability and utilization metrics as a better way to contract for service, you're going to find new places that money can be saved and efficiencies created with the help of your vendors. And then quickly, finally, selection, old world, right? The clinicians choose, the doctors tell you what they know best is right for the hospital, and the committee is then required to approve. We have a joke here in my office that the best way to resolve budget disputes is with boxing gloves. And but net of that, the new paradigm and the way that we encourage you to think about the selection process is what's right for the enterprise, for not only Dr. Jones, but all the other doctors and nurses and technologists, and ultimately the patient is most important. And how do we build consensus using data, right, that can get everybody feeling good about a decision that used to be maybe won with boxing gloves? It's a whole different, and by the way, it's a lot more fun. I mean, people are a lot less cranky at the end of that process.
Well, we would prefer, Peter, instead of having a kind of a boxing match, we actually would have a beauty pageant.
There you
right.
go.
So however well you dressed up your request, especially for capital, or how well you campaigned getting other leaders to buy into your capital request really became the outcome. That is really old way of thinking of how to make these big capital investments, like you said, that are going to last for 10 to 15 years. So really leveraging data and building that consensus is really kind of the new paradigm that we're shifting to.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and we see it working in a lot of places. The other thing that I would tell you that is a huge secondary benefit of this kind of mindset, the data-driven, consensus-building technology selection, is that it's a great way to engage and get genuine kind of investment on the part of your suppliers, right? Because there's a much deeper level of information. It starts not as a beauty pageant, but as a fact-based, data-driven selection process, which advantages the leaders in technology, advantages the leaders in financial efficiency, and that's what you guys are looking for. So again, don't underestimate that this isn't just an internal new approach, but the way you can use this mindset and some of the tools we'll share can really change the landscape and how you engage and leverage your vendor structure. And then finally, at the end of life, many of the CFOs that we work with and CEOs and supply chain heads and everyone says, I just traded it. Get rid of it. I'll get a credit. It's easier, right? Until, and Matt will prove to you firsthand in a second, that you got to do your homework, and the idea now that let's look at the asset value, start with the facts, what's it worth, should we reuse it, how can we recover value, very different way of looking at asset value that's usable inside the hospital that can be applied to the best use, best outcome. So what we call the solution and just to put this all into a bucket in terms of a new approach, is really taking a comprehensive life cycle approach to medical equipment spending that helps hospitals bend their cost curve. And the benchmarking 2.0 is really meant to suggest an improvement upon and an innovation against an existing activity, benchmarking, that most of you probably already embrace and support. The difference in a 2.0 approach is the new paradigm shift, better data, and not only focusing on identifying savings that are sort of obvious, but also digging deeper and finding new pockets of savings that you can both find and actually get. And let's talk about some of those. So here are a couple examples from the work that my company has done that will sort of set up and parallel some of the examples Matt will share from Hennepin County. So what we're trying to do here is just give you some examples of how other hospitals, just like many of you, are applying the strategies and the best practices that we're talking about today to drive hard dollar savings. So here's an example of a hospital that needed to acquire and expand their oncology platform and linear accelerators. This was actually at the end of a calendar year. They were in a hurry to get the deal done because the pricing that had been offered to them was set to expire. But they realized at the 11th hour that they really hadn't dug into some of the alignment of coverage on the systems, software components that may be needed not on day one, but on probably day 365. And then they realized that based on their current census and capacity, that they might need a third additional unit to swing to support their volume. And again, in 48 hours, they had to figure this out, adjust anything in the vendor quote, and if it's a linear accelerator, you can probably guess at which one of two companies it was. And most important, they recognized that if it wasn't aligned properly with their clinical operations, that not only would the cost maybe be out of whack, but it wouldn't optimize their throughput for what was expected to be a 10-year life. They re-looked at the deal, they engaged the vendor, they challenged a couple key assumptions and recognized that they could adjust their service coverage, reduce cost in one area. The vendor was willing to let them lock in price for a short duration to review their census problem. And they were able to get the deal done and signed within 48 hours, only after they locked in an incremental $750,000. $750,000. And for perspective, this is a hospital health system that was operating at about a 3% margin. That savings in 48 hours was the equivalent of $25 million in incremental patient revenue that gets fully paid and reimbursed, dropping down to the bottom line at their 3% rate. That's an awful lot of incremental revenue that is on the table. Next, I also want to point out on that linear accelerator strategy, if you think about 10 years, this may be a transactional example, but it adjusts their cost structure on this service line for the next 10 years to come. So really, really critical to understand how your efforts can permanently impact some of this stuff or for a very long time frame. So the next one is an example of a hospital that decided that they were interested in reducing costs. They really didn't have a choice. And they were willing to take risk on coverage of their women's health mammography fleet, meaning they had previously had full service coverage. They recognized the value of that, but in an era of needing to find new sources of savings, they decided to go at risk, but they did a very, very smart thing. Again, going at risk is a transactional decision. Building contingencies that reserve funds that would otherwise get pulled back and I'm sure, Matt, in your opinion, get put to some greater use every time, right? Yeah. But they were smart enough to anticipate and predict the risk of failure on some of these critical digital detectors and had set the expectation, managed that cost in, and even after reserving for the detectors that they ended up needing to buy a couple of, right, they netted out $430,000, 80% savings against what they would have paid. Again, this isn't just about cutting costs, but it's about optimizing and making sure that you protect and defend that which is critical to delivering patient care. Again, for this hospital, 2% margin, patient revenue equivalent, $21.5 million in incremental revenue. Third and finally, this is a large community health system that was cycling through and replacing their fleet of patient monitors. They were going to trade them in. Again, it was an offer from the vendor. They assumed that was good. They were going to move it forward until a resourceful member of their team said, wait a minute, don't we need a couple of these down the street in another facility? And oh, by the way, I think these are selling for a decent amount of money. And in the course of about a week, they relooked at their contracting strategy. They relooked at the value of the asset. They identified that they could get a lot more money, $491,000 more. And for perspective, you know, that's 100% more than they were being given on that trade-in. So final impact, $12.27 million in equivalent patient revenue value based on a 4% margin, which is what this particular facility was operating at. So I hope these examples are helpful. Matt's going to give you much more of the hands-on how he did it, but the point is this is happening across the country. There are opportunities that are available to each of you, and I hope that you know, we'll continue to encourage and give you the belief that you can bring these things to your facility. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt, who's going to give you the how-to.
Thanks, Peter. So this is where the now IT guy, once supply chain guy, takes over and just talks and really wants to share with everyone the strategies that we've used, especially at Hennepin, to successfully drive some curve, some bending the curve for our cost reduction strategies, both from supply chain as well as within IT. And it really kind of starts off with, you know, really trying to avoid the good enough trap. You know, the things you will hear in hospitals of, hey, we got the budget, we're good, or, you know, hey, we got the GPO price, minus 3% is being good. That really is the old traditional way of thinking, and it really isn't good enough. There are better ways of driving down costs. So as we look at, you know, really kind of this good enough trap, we want to avoid the illusions of things being good enough or getting a good price for various equipment. And as a hospital leader, you know, we need to set the tone for how the team operates, and a good enough mindset is something that we need to avoid, and really acting as a change agent to lead the team to get, you know, the best price versus kind of a good enough price. First, you know, is, you know, insisting on best outcomes that have been validated. And although a 10% reduction of the first quote you got might seem good enough, it could have been possible that 20% with the use of good data was actually more possible. And we've seen this from time to time where we get a vendor and through time and just trying to kind of wear them out, we see the price dropping. Sometimes it's at the end of the year, end of the quarter, but we know with getting other data from outside, and at times when we've used Peter, we know that 20% was really the price we should have been targeting. We've also been, you know, really been driving with our teams to not fall for, you know, GPO price minus 3%, or, you know, let's get a little bit below that, and really empowering our teams to drive to a better price for the equipment and looking beyond just the traditional definitions of success. Choosing the easiest path is really, I think, a trap that we fall into a lot, especially during capital budget processes, and timelines seem to be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in today's age. And so when we look at the easiest path, we try to overcome that fear of going down a different path with our vendors. I've heard about budgets. We got the budget for it, and that appears to be the biggest effort, when in reality, that should be the simplest. Once we have the budget, that is our starting point, and we empower our teams to not use, you know, the budget, you know, level as our measure of success, but really what is the right number for these purchases. And we all want savings, right? I mean, that's, you know, in supply chain, it was, hey, we got, you know, $100,000 in savings. But really looking beyond that, there was a point in time in supply chain that I began to communicate that a lot of the savings might be in the form of something out in year 7 or 10. And if we can get a good purchase price, but really look at, the better contracting as savings that are more rich in substantial benefits, not just an initial purchase price, we've all won. So I'm looking back into 2010 when I was in supply chain, and we had a capital process, and it was time to upgrade our IV pump fleet. And it was brought forth as, $1.5 million spend, and our fleet was fully depreciated off the books, and it felt that, $1.5 million spend for a fleet of 500 IV pumps was a good value. However, it seemed odd to me that 450 IV pumps weren't worth something. And I gave Peter a call, and I think I either texted you. I think we had text messaging back then. And I said, I have 450 IV pumps. Is that worth anything? It's showing a book value of 0, but these have to be worth something. And 15 minutes later, $180,000 was the value of the trade-in of those IV pumps. And so thus that reduced the total cost of that capital.
That's a really good point that Matt makes. Is it was not only 15 minutes, but about 15 minutes later, a new contract came over with $180,000 removed. So it's hard dollar savings. It's not funny money. But Matt just made a point that I want to emphasize. Most of you know it. The clinicians don't always. Net book value and market value are not the same thing. Do not underestimate that they may not understand that. So when they hear fully depreciated, they hear, oh, it's worth 0, when that's not really the case. So again, a really simple principle is make sure that you have an independent validation of asset value to help as you shape your capital spend and plans.
Absolutely. So in a more recent story in IT, our team was really empowered to take a different look at traditional models and approaches of working with a trusted vendor. And if you're familiar with IT, as I'm sure many of the finance folks are, IT is nothing but cheap. And it really is challenging in the IT world when you're relying heavily on technologists and techies to evaluate the cost of a widget or of a piece of equipment in a very objective manner. And it's very hard to get them out of the traditional paradigm of just trusting the vendor, who in most cases, we've had these long-term relationships. So
or falling in love with their product because they know how to support it.
Well, they know how to work it, right? So they know that they're going to be the ones called at 1 o'clock in the morning should it fail. And I'd like to know more about that piece of equipment than something new. So earlier this year, I really empowered our IT team to take a different approach of how we were going to be procuring some hardware. And, really looking at, fact-based logic. And, we know that people have really good intentions. They want to do a good thing. But they are not looking at all the data that is available out there, and versus what they perceive to be correct as being personal facts versus what the market has can be two different things. So we wanted to not try to push people at a personal level and emotional level, but let's use some data and some facts that are out there. So we did engage Peter's team in looking at some storage arrays that we were buying, and these things are extremely expensive and can be very, very difficult to understand the total cost of ownership out in the future years. And given the rapid changes that's happening within technology, it's hard to forecast what that cost might truly be out in year 4 or 5. So we had a long-term vendor that we had been working with, and really empowered the team to look at some other options and understanding how we could really leverage some new technology in that way, because we wanted to increase our flexibility of our infrastructure, but also look at ways of where we could bend the support costs. our CFO was continually asking, Matt, why is storage continuing to go up? And, you know, in some regards, the cost per storage is actually going down.
More storage.
But you are storing a lot more, so the consumption is what's going up. But how do you do this in a very rapidly changing technology environment that we have, you know, here? So really thinking beyond the initial quote and strategizing with Peter and his team, we were able to drive some substantial savings, upwards of 26%, by looking at the total cost. And I believe that the number was closer to $300,000 as we looked out beyond year 5, where we got extended warranty periods that was half the price of buying a new piece of equipment in that year. And so, one, we looked at, you know, data to help drive that decision, but also looking at different technologies that existed to drive those savings.
I mean, I'm going to give Matt a little more credit than he's given himself for his team. I mean, you had to change minds, but you didn't force it. You allowed them to lead themselves to that conclusion. I mean, that's what we saw, right? I abandoned, if I'm a technologist at Hennepin County, I abandoned a proven technology that I had worked with for years that I knew and trusted, not because my boss made me, but because my boss allowed me to see for myself that maybe it was worth it, because we were also laying people off, right? I mean, that's the environment you get. So I think part of what I want to make sure comes across is that as leaders, each of you have an opportunity to help, you know, lead your team to the conclusions maybe that are in their best interest, but that empowerment through data and through facts, especially for, you know, I know better technologists, really is a very, very powerful force that has, as Matt said, lasting, permanent structural advantages for the hospital.
Absolutely. So we'll keep going here. We got our third one, and you know, we do need an interpreter sometimes when we're working with different parties, and this has become an increasingly common situation when we are buying equipment, that we do actually need an interpreter nowadays. So you know, really, when trying to get all the constituents on the same page, it does require.
Do that?
I think we can. I mean, my wife is an interpreter, and she probably could help. But when we're in healthcare and working with different parties, it can be a bit challenging. And working with those to drive consensus can be just as difficult and not easy. So we do find ourselves playing this translator role, and you know, not only intentionally, but also with our vendors as well. So at HCMC, well, I'm gonna back up here one second. At HCMC, I'm gonna lead into this a little bit. We are in the midst of opening up a new building that really is requiring us to put this in action and in place today. And so, getting the team to speak the same language has been great. Has been one of our challenges. So, I don't speak Swahili, Peter, but can you say what that means again?
So what this means in Swahili is we are over budget. And we thought that might be relevant for all of you from a finance perspective. And the point that we wanted to try to convey was that don't underestimate that sometimes some of the dialogue and some of the information that's exchanged between clinicians and finance and supply chain can feel almost as foreign as the words on this page may feel to each of you. And obviously we're trying to emphasize it, but I think if we can help encourage to make sure you hear and are able to hear each other, we've seen it do pretty powerful things, and at Hennepin it's been really important.
Absolutely. So we do know at times these internal conversations can seem foreign to each other. And you know, in the case at Hennepin, opening up a new building, leveraging consensus to optimize a budget that, you know, never meets all of our needs and our wish list has really brought our teams together. And so we are creating a new facility to expand and consolidate outpatient specialty clinics into a single facility in downtown Minneapolis. It's our biggest facility project in over 40 years. And we are seeing the massive benefits for us by really leveraging the money we have available to gain more equipment that we need for the hospital. We had a budget of $35 million, yet the request added up to $40 million. And, at first everyone focused on their unique needs. We don't have this, we want this special, bladder scanner, we want this special thermometer, we're used to this, Dr. X only likes this. But by helping, each department understand how their needs fit with everyone else's, we were able to identify ways to really pare down the cost without cutting equipment, which traditionally has been the approach. And you have individuals who don't understand the clinical ramifications of cutting out 2 or 3 of this device, could have. And so by combining each department's needs and standardizing equipment, we were able to drive down, the cost and really overall equip this facility with new equipment that met the needs. So this will permanently provide a structural cost advantage that is key to our ongoing efforts to continue to bend the cost curve. So I'll just summarize these 3 strategies. Bits and flavors of this are always applied, but avoid that good enough trap. We think we had a good quote price. That might not be always the best. We like to use facts and data, and what Peter's company has available to us really can help us make more objective decisions when determining those price. And being that translator, it is a constant balance of being able to speak the same language amongst the various disciplines within healthcare.
Awesome. Well, again, we threw a lot of examples out to all of you, which I hope are just meant to be representative, I think, support for the idea that this opportunity in the medical equipment lifecycle costs is real, it's substantial, it's strategically relevant, and for many of you mission critical. But I think equally, when you look at a hospital like Hennepin, who's a public health facility, level 1 trauma center, operating in many of the same conditions and challenges that I'm sure many of you face, they're able to accomplish things partly out of necessity, but also partly out of the decision to do things differently and adapt to some of the challenges that that have and probably will continue to be fairly present. If you look at what you can do, and hopefully coming out of this session, if you think about bending your cost curve overall, medical equipment is a piece that can contribute probably disproportionately to efforts that you may already have going on. So we'd encourage you to hopefully remember that this is a categoric $12 billion opportunity for all of you together, but $3.6 million annually for the typical 300-bed hospital. And if you're operating a 1% margin, that $3.6 million is the equivalent of selling $360 million in incremental patient revenue that you don't have to find every year. So again, it can be very, very meaningful. Use the new approaches. Test yourself and your colleagues' willingness to try new things and maybe think a little bit differently using some of the data and facts that are or should be available to you. And then think about using some of the best practices and strategies that Matt explained and shared with you that I think, again, there's no one size fits all, but tackle the big stuff, and you're going to be surprised at just how easy it is. So with that, we did want to save time for questions and see if anybody does have any questions that they want to ask.
Great. Thank you, Matthew and Peter, for that very valuable collaboration. Before I take our first question, just want to remind everyone to type their questions into the questions chat panel located to the right of your screen, and we'll take as many as time will allow. Again, just to remind everyone, I did get a couple questions about accessing the slides. You can expand the handout section also to the right of your screen and click on the PDF icon and gain access to that you don't have to wait for that. All right, so let's jump right into our first question, and it reads, if we know how much money we're spending on medical equipment, could you tell us how much we could save?
Matt wants me to take that one. I mean, there's a smart aleck answer, which is a lot, but there's the more accurate answer, which is that it's really hard to know exactly what the universe of opportunity looks like without understanding the composition of your fleet, the age of your equipment, the service coverage and risk profile that your hospital has chosen to enter into, and also some of the criticalities from a clinical standpoint. That said, if you're a 300-bed hospital, the math that we see year over year over year across regions, across budget cycles, is that $12,000 per bed rolling up to about $3.6 million in potential savings, which is based on that 12 to 16% number we shared with you. So if you just apply that logic to your number of beds, obviously if you've bought and just installed a bunch of new equipment and technology, you're going to probably have a smaller opportunity now, but a bigger opportunity in future years. Conversely, if you have an older fleet, if you've deferred capital investments, you probably have a more substantial opportunity. Potentially, we see a lot of clients north of 20% in hard dollar realized savings against spend that they were already planning on making. Thanks, Nikki.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from David. He's asking if you can compare leasing to capital purchase.
Well, I mean, I would say we continue to look at leasing versus certainly capital, and I think it really depends on your financial situation. You know, at Hennepin, you know, generally working with zero margin and being good financial stewards of the public's resources and such, we do continue to look at those options. There are situations, and I think there probably more, but we don't find leasing always being a good option for us. There generally are other stipulations that come with leasing equipment. But you know, we do compare those and evaluate those options, but I don't have, you know, probably any good examples right now, Peter, that I would share.
I've got a couple. You know, it's important to remember that leasing is simply a payment strategy, right? It's simply a way of funding capital acquisition and potentially support. Some people wrap that in. But a couple points about leasing. One is it depends on the financial flexibility you need, right? A lease is a contract that's written to term, and often what we see is when you go to term on a lease, there are substantial rollover penalties, extension penalties, that if you don't recontract and refresh on the appropriate calendar, it can get very, very expensive. I mean, double overnight. And we know that the lease industry, a lot of the money and profits that they make are on the unplanned, unexpected variables that may come up. The other thing that I would point out is that we increasingly see in the work that we do that your suppliers have great resources, either in-house captive financing or sometimes third-party affiliations, where they can bring creative financing to you guys. So whether it's a leasing or a purchase or kind of a unitary payment model, which we're seeing more and more of, right? I get whatever I want and I have one flat payment monthly or quarterly. Don't be afraid to challenge your suppliers to find new solutions and say, I need new programs. What are you seeing and what can you offer me? And we've been pleased to see what they bring to the table for the hospitals we're working with. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you. And this next question is directed for Peter. It comes from Sherry. She wants to know if you work with using departments as well as the purchasing department. She commented that the newer leaders tend to start their own projects without going through the organization's buyer. And she also added that they are a 114-bed hospital and a system of rural and fee-for-service in OP clinics, just to provide further insight.
Oh, that's great, and thank you, Sherry. And listen, as a 114-bed, you know, acute care hospital, we appreciate what you do, and it's hard, right? I mean, with the consolidation in the industry, you know, finding capital and having the right resources can be challenging. So, you know that you've got lots of good company of folks trying to solve the same thing. Do you have a point of view on this? I mean,
Do I have a point of view on it? I
don't want to be disparaging of a leader perspective, because I think there's different strategies, but how do you?
I mean, I've seen these situations occur, and I do think this is, there's reasons for it. And as we look to partner, whether you're from supply chain or a using department, I mean, IT is a user. We have to work with supply chain and our purchasing department to procure stuff, and so I do see that sometimes being a challenge. Yet we as leaders we want people to work together and to collaborate to make sure that we're doing what's best for the organization.
Yeah, and I'll echo that, but I think again every hospital is different, so I don't believe there's a one size fits all. We hear from a lot of the supply chain leaders that we work with that they often feel like they're the last to know about an initiative that involves capital resources or longer-term planning and product selection. And we hear it as a frustration because we know they want to do a good job, but they're often not given enough time to influence or play as meaningful a role. And that also diminishes the work that they're doing, and we want to encourage and make sure everybody continues to feel motivated to feel that their voice can be heard. So we do think that a lot of projects get kicked off. Sometimes they're a pet project of a particular clinical department, or they're spawned from some kind of a research or product collaboration. But in my experience, my opinion is it can be very destructive to the outcome, and particularly as we talk about the new paradigm that we refer to and encourage the new approach in thinking about that consensus, data-driven consensus building. Involving all the key stakeholders early, in our experience, allows you to better see all the costs, better map the total cost of ownership, and get the buy-in from the users, the clinical departments, the biomed, and everybody in finance, and get to the best outcome. So that's our answer.
All right, thank you for that. Let's see if we can squeeze in just two more. This next question is from Matt. It says, as a government entity, wouldn't you already qualify for the best price?
Well, so just a little bit of backdrop. HCMC is a wholly owned subsidiary of the county, and so we're able to act, individually of our procurement decisions, but we are sort of in the best of both worlds, where we are able to, in most cases, leverage government pricing, but also leverage GPO pricing as well. I've become very good over my 8 years at Hennepin to be very good at playing the "we are a poor safety net public hospital" card, and I'm actually really good at creating fake tears. So we do that, and we leverage those opportunities. But working with our suppliers and explaining to them our situation and developing that relationship, is first and foremost. But we also want to be sure that we're making good purchasing decisions. So our teams are definitely empowered to understand what we're buying all the way down to the nitty-gritty detail of that. And you might think that sometimes we are getting the best price, but there are times where we're getting the best price, but we're buying too much of it. I like to tease Peter about, an example that I was involved in where we were buying a CT machine, and we thought we were getting a pretty good price, but we also were buying dual wireless foot pedals. And those were costs that we ended up incurring that maybe we didn't need. And so, yes, it might be a good price, but is it the right product we should be buying? Do we really need that Cadillac of that? So.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I know that there are a couple more questions in the queue, but the presenters were kind enough to provide their contact information, which you see on the screen, as well as contained within your slide deck. So I believe that you can follow up directly if your question did not get addressed. So I want to be very mindful and respectful of everyone's time. So as we approach the top of the hour, I do want to take this time to thank the HFMA members as well as the healthcare community for joining the call. As you exit, you will be prompted with a survey. So we appreciate you sharing your feedback about today's event as well as any other topics that you're looking for. Be sure if you view this webinar with some of your colleagues, perhaps you congregated around a computer, be sure to send in everyone's email address so we can be sure to assign credit to everyone who actually participated. So thank you again to our guest presenters, Matt Werder of Hennepin County Medical Center and Peter Robson of MEGA Solutions. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you, everybody, for choosing to spend time with us. And we certainly hope we shared something that will be useful for you.
Thank you for that.
And call either of us if you have questions.
That is very generous of you. We appreciate that. And on behalf of HFMA Region 8, thank you again for joining. And be sure to mark your calendars. 1025 is the next installment of their webinar series, and it is being hosted by the Heart of America HFMA chapter. Have a great afternoon, everyone.